Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Good morning. I'm not feeling very well, so please bear with me. I am dealing with what hair is weird and annoying. Anyway, are you guys ready? This is a video that David requested, and we've thought about doing for a couple of years, but since David asked, we're doing it this year, so hopefully you enjoy little bits of information that you hopefully haven't heard all of before. I know at least the last little bit you haven't heard, or I don't think you have anyway. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. It's for our friends. Let's see who it is today. It's our canoe race, because, well, boats. Start. 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 There we go. There we go. Alright, there's She Stole, there's Hiking Ontario, there's Amanda, there's Keep Digging, there's Vi, there's Vol, there's Frugal, there's Kate Eats, there's Bobby, Laura, Rich and Leo, Railroad, Scripping, Frugal, Carol, Mike's Garden, Eric, Nacha Daily, there's Wanda, then let's see here, there's Blended, and Scraping, and Northern Woman, and Carol, and Stance, let's see here, there's Susan, there's Pinned, Laura, and Neo, and it looks like it's going to be Miss Gloria. Hold on. Alright, this is Miss Gloria's channel. As you see, she does cooking, vlogs, reviews, unboxing, traveling, and more. Most of her videos are cooking. As you can see, here's a Parmesan, and here's a short for Parmesan, cauliflower, coconut cupcakes, car being towed away. Oh dear, that's not good. And then we've got some shorts with his cars and food. And then, of course, her lies, which isn't done a little bit, but it does occasionally do lies. And so check Miss Gloria out. Like, sure, comment, and have a good day. And it's charging it. There you go, it's behind you. Do you want me to hand it to you? You just want me to leave it in the regular place?
Just leave it in the regular place.
Love it. It's behind you. Then it's recording.
Yep.
Whenever you're ready.
I'm gonna go for it.
We're doing part 1 of David's requested video.
Yes, the bearded historian has been requested by David Budd because he seems to have a habit, which is kind of cool, of finding something that was kind of terrible but very fascinating. And on this date, in 1912, the Titanic sank off the coast of Newfoundland. Now, a lot of this information, is going to be, old hat. People remember it. A lot of things that people don't realize is that, technology back then, if you wanted to go from Europe to America, aircraft was just barely off the ground. They weren't really doing transcontinental flights very much. And so your shipping was your primary way to go from, in this case, England to what would have been the United States. Uh, and some of it was also kind of a compounding need. The company that was putting together these massive ships, the big vessels that they were working with, the one company pulled up the White Star Line. They, were registered out of Liverpool, England, and they were supposed to go from Southampton to New York City. Originally, the ship was ordered back in 1908, in September. The builder, Harland, Wolff, and Belfast, at the cost of $1.5 million, or 180 million pounds in today's economy. It was laid down for build in March 31st, 1909, launched on May 31st, 1911, and completed on the 2nd of April, 1912. That maiden voyage would kick off on the 10th, in service the same day, and it went out of service 15th. So it had a really long lifespan. But to think of this ship, you go through the numbers. Displacement, 52,000 tons. It was 882 feet 9 inches long. Its beam was 92 feet 6 inches. Height of 175 feet, keel to the top of the funnels. Depth 64 feet 6 inches. And it had 9 decks. Now, impressively, in installed power, it had 24 double-ended and 5 single-ended boilers, feeding 2 reciprocating steam engines for the wing propellers and a low-pressure turbine for the center propeller. Basically, output 46,000 horsepower. The propulsion was 2 3-blade wing propellers and 1 center propeller. The speed, 21 knots at a max of 23, and the capacity was 2,453 passengers and 874 crew members. The stickler point, lifeboats. There were only 20 of them, sufficient for about 1,178 people. Now, on its launch, it was the largest ship afloat on entering service, and the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners that the White Star Line built. The ship was built, again, Harland and Wolff Shipbuilding Company in Belfast. Thomas Andrews J., the chief naval architect of the shipyard, died in the disaster. The Titanic was under the command of Captain Edward John Smith, who also went down with the ship, and everybody's favorite scalawag, J. Bruce Imsay, White Star Line's chairman, managed to get to a lifeboat and survived. Now, first-class accommodations, very ritzy, were designed to be the pinnacle of comfort and luxury. Included a gymnasium, swimming pool, smoking rooms, fine restaurants and cafes, a Victorian-style Turkish bath, and hundreds of opulent cabins. A high-powered radio telegraph transmitter was available to send passengers micro-anagrams and for the ship's operational use. Titanic had advanced safety features such as watertight compartments and remotely activated watertight doors, which contributed to the reputation that the ship was unsinkable. Well, it was equipped with 16 lifeboat davits, each capable of lowering 3 lifeboats, for a total capacity of 48 boats. Now, despite this capacity, the ship was scantily equipped with only 20 lifeboats, and 14 of these were regular lifeboats, 2 were cutter lifeboats, while 4 were collapsible and proved difficult to launch while the ship was sinking. Together, the lifeboat could only hold 1,178 people, roughly half the number of passengers on board, and a third of the number of passengers that the ship could have carried at full capacity, a number consistent with maritime safety regulations of the era. Now, the British Board of Trade's regulations required 14 lifeboats for a ship of 10,000 tons. The Titanic carried 6 more than required, actually, allowing 338 extra people room in the lifeboats. When the ship sank, lifeboats had been lowered and were only filled up to an average of 60%.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. Now, Titanic, as they say, derived from the Titans of Greek mythology, Belfast, Ireland. It was then the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The RMS Titanic was the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners. The lead vessel was the Olympic. The final ship of the class was the HMHS Britannic. They were by far the largest vessels of the British Shipping Company in the White Star Line's fleet, which comprised of 29 steamers and tenders in 1912. The 3 ships had their genesis in a discussion in mid-1907 between the White Star Line's chairman, J. Bruce Imsay, and the American financier, J.P. Morgan, who controlled the White Star Line's parent corporation, the International Mercantile Marine Company. J.P. Morgan, he had his name in just about everything back then. Now, the White Star Line faced challenges from its main rivals, the Cunard Line, which, with the aid of the Admiralty, had recently launched the twin sister ships Lusitania and Mauretania. Now, Lusitania, for the history buffs, was the ship that got sank by the Germans, which pushed the U.S. into World War I. These were the fastest passenger ships then in service, and the Germans also had ships. They had the Hamburg America and the Norddeutscher Lloyd. Ismay preferred to compete on size rather than speed, and proposed to commission a new class of liners larger than anything that had come before, which would be the last word in comfort and luxury. They love to talk if they don't got money. The new ships would have sufficient speed to maintain a weekly service with only 3 ships instead of the original 4. Olympic and Titanic would replace the RMS Teutonic of 1889, the RMS Majestic of 1890, and the RMS Adriatic of 1907. The RMS Oceanic first departed from a new home port in June of 1907, along with the Teutonic, Majestic, and the new Adriatic on the Southampton, New York run. Now, ships were being constructed, which had a long-established relationship with the White Star Line at Harland and Wolff, dating back to 1867. I mean, it's almost the end of the Civil War. Harland and Wolff were given a great deal of latitude in designing the ships for the White Star Line. The usual approach was for Wilhelm Wolff to sketch a general concept, which Edward James Harland would then turn into a ship design. Cost considerations were a relatively low priority. Harland and Wolff were authorized to spend what it needed for the ships, plus a 5% profit margin. In the case of the Olympic-class ships, the cost of £3 million, or 370 million pounds in today's money, would be the first 2 ships were agreed, plus extras to contract and the usual 5% fee. Now, Harland and Wolff put their leading designers to work designing these Olympic-class vessels. The design was overseen by Laurent Perrier, a director of both Harland and Wolff and the White Star Line, naval architect Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland and Wolff's design department, Edward Wilding, Andrews' deputy and responsible for calculating the ship's design, stability, and trim, and Alexander Carlisle, the ship's chief draughtsman and general manager. Carlisle's responsibilities included the decorations, equipment, and all the general arrangements, including the implementation of an efficient lifeboat design. Well, on the 29th of July, 1908, Harland and Wolff presented the drawings to J. Bruce Imsay and other White Star Line executives. Imsay approved the design and signed 3 letters of agreement 2 days later, authorizing the start of construction. Well, at this point, the first ship, which was later to become the Olympic, had no name but was referred to simply as number 400, as it was Harland and Wolff's 400th hull. Titanic was based on the revised version of the same design and was given the number 401. Now, one of the things that kind of struck my interest when I was going through history pieces Apparently, up here in South Dakota, there were a couple folks who survived the Titanic and are buried up here. Now, the first fellow was a guy named Olaf Jorgensen Adelseth. He's a third-class passenger. Now, he was born in 1886 on a farm in Romsdal County, Oslo, Norway. Last name was also given as Cleve, a farmer, and he would wind up getting married in 1879 at also more on Romsdal County, Norway. He had siblings of Inga, Hannah, Gina, Gurun Thora, and Hans, all natives of Osgorg. The two oldest daughters of the family have not been traced after 1900. The Alseth part of the name seems to have been added later. By 1900, the family lived at the Cleveland farm, and they seem to have been relatively well off because they employed a servant and old daughter in 1868. There also was a foster daughter in the household, Olive O. Trenfornes, in 1898 when she was born. Now, Olaf had worked as a sailor and a casual laborer. He went to America with his brother Hans in 1902 or 1903, and they lived in Hatton, North Dakota, where he worked in a couple different farms in the Red River Valley. Well, in 1908, he established a livestock farm in Perkins County, South Dakota, and after a difficult period at this farm, Olaf decided to visit his relatives in Norway, and he departed from Glasgow by the steamship from New York in the late autumn of 1911. From Glasgow, he continued his journey to Scandinavia. Now, along came April 1912. Olaf began the return journey, and he started his destination was Johann B. Absaleth, 1112 Lincoln Street, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, traveling with him were 5 other Norwegians, Ada Humlin, Anna Salzwerskik, Peter Solholt, a cousin, Sigurd Hansen Moen, married to Olaf's sister Igni, and Karen Marie Elseth. Karen Elseth was not a relative, maybe a cousin, but was the daughter of one of Olaf's neighbors when he lived in Norway. They knew each other well. Since Karen was only 16, her father asked Olaf if he could look after her on the trip to America. Why not? Nice family. Now, the party set sail from Oslo to Newcastle via Bergen and boarded the Titanic at Southampton. Olaf and Humlin shared a cabin towards the bow on the F deck, from where, on the night of the disaster, he made his way aft along the working alleyway, aka Scotland Road, on the E deck to meet Karen. He finally found her near the main third-class staircase towards the stern, where she, Olaf, and the rest of their group made their way to the aft well deck. They waited on the poop deck for instructions. At about 1:30 a.m., third-class women were finally allowed onto the boat deck, followed by the men at 2. Well, many decided to remain on the poop deck. Olaf and his relatives made for the boat deck. Olaf, together with Moen and Solholt, placed Karen Absaleth into a boat. Well, as the last boat was pulling away, they heard a call for sailors. Some of the crew were trying to free a collapsible, and Olaf, who had had 6 years of sailing experience as a fisherman, was tempted to assist, but his cousin and brother-in-law urged him to stay with them. Well, it mentioned, he said, I was standing there and I asked my brother-in-law if he could swim, and he said no. I asked my cousin if he could swim, and he said no. So we could see the water coming up, and the bow of the ship was going down, and there was kind of an explosion. We could hear the popping and cracking. The deck raised up and got so steep that the people could not stand on their feet on the deck. So they fell down and slid on the deck into the water, right on the ship. Well, when all these boats were gone, Olaf and his relatives found themselves near the 4th funnel as the Titanic sank deeper, and they clung to the falls of the lifeboat davits. His brother-in-law urged him to jump for it, but Olaf waited. When the water was only 5 feet away, they plunged in. As he surfaced, Olaf became entangled in a line, somehow managed to break free. When he looked around, His brother-in-law and cousin were nowhere to be seen. They had been washed away. Ola swam for about 20 minutes in the icy water before finally reaching collapsible A. Surrounded by dead and dying, he tried to pull himself into the waterlogged boat, but someone inside shouted, "Don't capsize the boat!" So Olas clung to the side for a while before eventually dragging himself aboard. He did what the guy in Titanic would do. Of course, I can't imagine trying to swim for 20 minutes in that ice-cold water. Not good. Well, as they rode through the night, the survivors of Collapsible A prayed, and although nearly waist-deep in water, Olas tried to revive a fellow passenger who lay freezing in the bottom of the boat. He lifted him up and discovered that he was a man from New Jersey whom Olas shared a carriage on the boat train to Southampton. When the Carpathia was sighted, he urged the man to look up, but as dawn broke, the man slipped away. Another man put his arms around Albaceth to relieve cramps caused by the cold, but eventually he too died, and Olas had to pry the man's arms off him.
Ew.
Yeah. When he finally reached the deck of Carpathia at 7 a.m., he was given a warm blanket, and he headed for the dining room for some brandy and a hot coffee. With cabin space at a premium, Olas found he had to sleep on deck and lay down to sleep in the same clothes he had worn all night in the flooded boat. Well, at New York, he stayed a few days at the St. Vincent Hospital. He also testified before the U.S. Senate inquiry before moving on to Minneapolis. During 1912 and 1913, he traveled to Canada, Indianapolis, and Montana before returning to his farm in South Dakota. Now, in July of 1915, he married Anna Grind in South Dakota. Anna was Ole's first wife, he her second husband. Anna had been born in Grind, Norway in 1877. Her father had died at sea in Norwegian waters near Sognefjorden on the 19th of June, 1886. The death occurred only 9 days after Olas was born, and Anna was 8. Well, Olas worked on his farm for a further 30 years, and he and Anna had 4 children. Their second son died at the age of 3.5, and the other 3 children were George, Helen, and May. Now, he retired in 1946 to Reeder, North Dakota. We've been there. In 1948, they moved to Tacoma, Washington, and then in 1960, they moved to Wedding, North Dakota, before settling in Hettinger, North Dakota. We've been there too. Now, Anna celebrated her 100th birthday in 1977. She died in August of 1978. Olas died on the 4th of December, 1980. His daughter May, later Mrs. Harlan Orgon, lived in Sandpoint, Idaho, and his son George in Prairie City, South Dakota. Now, a couple of the interesting things. His cemetery, where he is buried, it's in Perkins County, but is a real tiny road stretch back there. And what's really funny is that the name of the cemetery is called the Scion Cemetery. But they have a different name for the graveyard itself. And if you went for the original graveyard, you wouldn't find it. And so we just happened to check it out. It's due north from Prairie City, and then you have to hang a left. But it's a very small cemetery. There's only like 12 headstones. But, you know, back then, that's what Pennington County was. That was people settling, trying to start their lives. You know, he was a farmer and a rancher, both. So, but that was one of our South Dakotan residents. Now, there was another fellow, and pull this up here. Oh, yes. Oscar Arvid Hedman. Quite a name. Again, third class passenger. 27, was born in Ulm, Sweden on the 5th of July, 1884. The son of Gustav Hedman. He had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. In 1905, he immigrated to the U.S., settling in Beach, North Dakota. Not many beaches in North Dakota.
Mm.
Well, in 1911, he was living in Bowman. We've been there. Where he was employed at the Carno Hotel as well as running automobiles for Western Land Securities Company, Obert A. Olson, and others. He personally owned land about a mile from the town. Hadman also recorded his living at 414 West 1st Street, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Well, in 1912, he was employed by the land firm J.P. Rogers and Company in St. Paul, Minnesota. He worked as a settler recruiter, basically someone who is sent by a U.S. state to recruit migrant workers. In this case, probably for a land firm. So, had been boarded the Titanic at Southampton and led a group of 17 migrants, a few of whom could speak English. The group included, among others, Bertha Nilsson, Hilda Hellstrom, and Oscar Leander Johansson. Well, Hadman shared a cabin with Malcolm Johnson, who he called Seaver. In a crowd on the way up the deck, they lost contact with each other, but Johansson found a lifebelt for himself. Hadman threw himself into a lifeboat in the last second. He told later that he thought to himself, if they're going to shoot me, I'd just die faster. It's not clear what lifeboat it was, but it was probably number 15. Contemporary newspaper reports gave sharply conflicting accounts of his escape. Well, the Women's Relief Committee in New York would wind up giving him $10. While in New York, he sent a telegram to his employer to send money for his trip to St. Paul, and the money received was enough to enable Anna Sundblom and Carl Olaf Johnson to take the same train. Bertha Nilsson was also in the group. On the 7th of November 1912, Hadman married Julia Mathilda Tilly Anderson. Sometime during his residence in North Dakota, Oscar began to train as an osteopath or chiropractor. It is unclear whether he ever completed his training, but he practiced for many years, albeit as an unlicensed capacity, and he was known by locals as Doc. However, because he never officially registered and his wife sometimes had to move from town to town to avoid citations for practicing without a license, in 1925, another source says 1920, they would settle in Oneida, cute little town, north of Pierre. He would wind up practicing there for almost 40 years. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Hadman had no children. Oscar Hadman died in Oneida in 1961, July 28th. Julia would pass away in 1965. I did read also some hand-to-hand accounts that apparently he did also suffer some PTSD from everything he went through. And he did not like to talk much about his experience. But, I mean, can you imagine going through all that? Not me. No. Now, the other one that they had that was kind of interesting, and this one, they don't have a lot of information on. There was a fellow who his name was Ole Olson. He started out, again, here in South Dakota. His folks had a farm in Day County at Langford. Sometime between 1885 and 1912, he would scratch his name into the wall of the family's granary. No one knew it was there until 2003, when they were renovating it and converting it into a craft house. Well, Ole was one of more than 1,500 people who died when the Titanic sunk. Ole's parents, who had homesteaded in Day County, he grew up there, later moved to Canada, started his own farm. He spent the holidays visiting family in Norway and was returning to Canada aboard the Titanic to begin spring planting. Well, Ole's mother refused to talk about the accident. She firmly believed her son had survived and would simply show up one day at their farm. But passengers like Ole stood little chance of making it out alive. Women and children were given priority as the lifeboats were being filled, resulting in a 70% survival rate. However, only 20% of the 1,670 men aboard the ship survived. Numbers were lowest among those traveling second and third class. Oddly, no kidding, 33% of the men traveling in first class were rescued. Many, including Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line's chairman, would endure social ostracism for fleeing the floundering ship with little or no regard to the other passengers and crew. And of course, Ismay would become the subject of one of the books that came out. Now, the interesting thing is, off of finding his name engraved in the wall, they actually made a small exhibit in his honor, framed the portion of the wall around his signature, and added the photos to information about Titanic at the Museum of the Titanic. So that was kind of a neat touch. Now, back when they talked about the Titanic, it was also kind of crazy because after the sinking had happened, again, the Carpathia showed up and started picking up passengers out of the frigid ice waters. From where it sank, it took that ship 3 days to get all the way to New York. Now, it took so long, they were actually able to transmit the data back to England. And what was crazy is that there was actually 3 different reports that were going on at one time. One report said that all the crew were saved and offloaded. Another one said that the ship made it safely. And the third one stated that the ship had sank and X number of passengers were killed. Of course, the thing that was also crazy, they had a flyer from the New York Times that still showed a scheduled April 20th departure. They were unable to pull the ad overnight in the April 15th printing.
Whoops.
Don't think they're going to be taking the Titanic.
What?
You know, also interesting, the Carpathia. For those of you who love multiple weather storms at one time, after leaving the scene of the disaster with the journey slowed by pack ice, fog, thunderstorms, and rough seas, they were able to wire out news on what had happened, leading the American press to report all sorts of things, like the Titanic was actually being towed to port by the SS Virginian. Late on the night of the 15th, the White Star reported a message receiving the Titanic had sank, but all the passengers and crew had been transferred to another vessel. Later that day, the confirmation came through that the Titanic, including, had been lost, and most of the passengers and crew had died. News attracted crowds of people to the White Star Line's offices in both London, New York, Montreal, Southampton, Liverpool, and Belfast. It hit hardest in Southampton, whose people suffered the greatest losses from the sinking. 4 out of every 5 crew members came from that town.
Wow.
Carpathia docked at 9:30 p.m. on the 18th of April in New York's Pier 54 and was greeted by some 40,000 people waiting at the quayside in heavy rain. Immediate relief in the form of clothing and transportation to shelters was provided by that Women's Relief Committee, the Travelers' Aid Society of New York, and the Council of Jewish Women, among other organizations. Many of the Titanic's surviving passengers did not linger in New York, but headed onwards immediately to their relatives' homes. Some of the more wealthier survivors chartered private trains to take them home, and the Pennsylvania Railroad laid a special train free of charge to take survivors to Philadelphia. Now, Titanic's 214 surviving crew members were taken to the Red Star Line steamer SS Lapland, where they were accommodated in passenger cabins. The Carpathia was hurriedly restocked with food and provisions before resuming its journey to Fiume, Austria-Hungary. The crew were given a bonus of a month's wages by Cunard as a reward for their actions, and some of the Titanic's passengers joined to give them an additional bonus of nearly £900, or £113,000, divided among the crew members. The ship's arrival in New York led to a frenzy of press interest, with the newspapers competing to be the first to report on survivors' stories. Some reporters would actually bribe their way aboard a pilot boat called the New York, which guided Carpathia into the harbor, and one even managed to get onto Carpathia before docking. Crowds gathered around outside news offices to see the latest reports being posted in the windows or on billboards. It took another 4 days for a complete list of casualties to be compiled and released, adding to the agony of relatives waiting for news of those who had been aboard the Titanic. Effectively, January 1912, the hulls and equipment of the Titanic and Olympic, interesting enough, had been insured by Lloyd of London. The total coverage was for £1 million per ship, and the policy was to be free from all average under 150,000, meaning that the insurers would only pay for damage in excess of that sum. Well,
No, I think they may have succeeded.
Pretty sure they got past that. Now, the premium negotiated by brokers William Faber and Company, now the Willis Group, was 75 pence per 100, or 7,500 for the term of 1 year. Lloyd's paid the White Star Line the full sum owed to them within 30 days. Many charities were set up to help the survivors and their families, many who had lost their sole wage earner, or in the case of many third-class survivors, everything they owned. In New York City, for example, a joint committee of the American Red Cross and the Charity Organization Society formed to disperse financial aid to survivors and dependents of those families who died. On the 29th of April, opera singers Enrico Caruso and Mary Garden and members of the Metropolitan Opera raised $12,000 or $300,000 in 2014 in money in benefits to victims for the disaster by giving special concerts in which versions of Autumn and Nearer My God to Thee were part of the program. In Britain, relief funds were organized by the families of Titanic's lost crew members, raising nearly £450,000. One such fund was still in operation as late as the 1960s.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
In the United States and Britain, more than 60 survivors combined to sue the White Star Line for damages. The claims totaled $16 million, for which was far in excess of what White Star argued it was responsible for as a limited liability company under American law. Because the bulk of the litigants were of the United States, White Star petitioned the United States Supreme Court in 1914, which ruled in its favor that it qualified as an LLC when it was found the causes of the ship's sinking were largely unforeseeable rather than due to negligence. Oh crap. This sharply limited the scope of damage survivors and family members were entitled to, prompting them to reduce the claims to some $2.5 million. White Star only settled for $664,000, about 27% of the original total by survivors. The settlement was agreed to by 44 of the claimants in 1915, with $500,000 set aside for the American claimants, $50,000 for the British, and $114,000 to go towards interest and legal expenses. But, for its day and age, again, you've got everybody who's got different conspiracy theories. You've got some people that talk about there was a fire that was started already early. The fact is, the ship hit an iceberg. And, there was speculation that maybe they should have ran into the iceberg straight on. It would have killed some of the crew. But they also think it might have kept them afloat long enough to get aid. There was the fact that there was a ship just off the... they could see the other ship. They fired flares. The other ship contemplated that they were just, celebrating. It's like, what were we supposed to do? Jump overboard and swim over to the other ship?
Yes.
Would have been creative, but of course they weren't answering their telegraph lines either, which made for a double suck. But it was an unmitigated disaster that happened, and I guess they did learn a lot of lessons after that, which is always sad that it takes death to make things happen. But again, on history, This has been the Bearded Historian. We'll see you folks next week with another topic. Have a good one.